Hi there. Welcome to Cook Local, Eat Local, the podcast where you can find inspiration, tips, and recipes for enjoying more local food and drink. I am David Crowley, your host. In today's episode, we'll be talking with Shruthi from Urban Farmie about this week's CSA share of veggies. This happens to be the final CSA pickup of the season we're talking about here. We have some butternut squash, as you might expect. Believe it or not, there's still corn coming in as we record this in early October. And we also have some Brussels sprouts, bok choy, and some kale. And finally, sweet potatoes to round things out. Now, let's see what ideas Shruthi has for these veggies. Shruthi is the recipe developer, photographer, and blogger behind Urban Farmie, a blog focused on seasonal, global, and vegetarian food. She has 2 graduate degrees from Stanford, including one focused on food systems. Her blog is inspired by her life and travels to 60-plus countries, and it features authentic recipes from those travels. She lives in Seattle with her husband. Hi, Shruthi. Welcome to Cook Local, Eat Local.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, as I was saying before, we hit record. It's been a bit of a hectic week, hectic day. So it's great to kind of come back and just have a good conversation about food. I was really curious about your bio. You've got a very interesting background. So I want to hear a little bit more about your interest in cooking in general, and then specifically how you came to your interest in topics like local food and food systems.
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up in a South Indian family in South India, and I feel like as it probably is with a lot of families, like food was the love language, right? Like knowing what somebody's favorite was, or when
Mm-hmm.
mangoes were in season, and
Oh, yeah.
the best ones for the grandchild of the family, aka me.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
right from childhood, I think I've always had a kind of sincere, deep appreciation for how food can really communicate love. I moved to the US now about 15 years ago to go to college. And when I was in college, I was really struck, I think, by the amount of food waste that I was seeing. It was like a
Mm-hmm.
stark contrast in some ways because I grew up in India where, you still see people really struggling to make ends meet and not being able to feed themselves. And then zoom over to a college campus at the dining commons, and you're just seeing plates of food being wasted.
Oh, sure.
And that dichotomy really stuck with me for a long time. And when I was in college, I was studying energy engineering, but kind of with a focus at the intersection of energy and agriculture.
Hmm.
Think stuff like biofuels and things
Oh,
like.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And as I started kind of reflecting on why the food waste and issues around that bothered me so much, I recognized that I was way more interested in the food side of things than I was on the energy side of things.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's kind of where the interest in food really started. And then, of course, kind of the coming of age story. You move to your first apartment, and fun fact, like I never cooked when I was growing up, despite
Mm-hmm.
growing up in a family that loved cooking so much.
Yep.
Um, and then I picked up, a few things here and there. Realized, I loved cooking. I loved hosting. I genuinely just enjoyed, I think, in the way that I experience love in the form of food, also sharing that love with other people. And so I think over the last 10 or so, 15 years now, I have managed to kind of do both of those things, which is tackle food systems topics around agriculture, nutrition, policy, etc., from a professional perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think, just cook up a storm in the kitchen, which is what led to my food blog on more of the personal perspective.
Oh, great. I can see that. I can see that. That's an interesting story. I can see how those things would come together. And yeah, sometimes in these conversations, like these big theories or, the technical sides, it's intellectually interesting, but there's nothing like, I think I'm similar to you. I like those topics, but at the end of the day, it is centered around cooking and enjoying and sharing that tasty food. So Maybe to warm us up, actually, speaking of tasty food, I know we want to talk about what's in my CSA share this week, but before that, let me throw the one at you. Tell us like where you are these days, what's fresh and local, and maybe something delicious you've had recently, whether you've made it or somebody else made it for you. I'd love to hear that.
Absolutely. So as of recording right now, I am in Seattle, which is where I usually live with my with my husband, and my mom is here now too. And what did I have recently that I really enjoyed? Well, I mean, it's always amazing when moms are around, right? Because
Yeah,
you get to enjoy all of the benefits of amazing food without having to do cooking yourself. Uh,
right.
and recently, she made this tomato relish, which is like a spicy sesame infused tomato jam, basically a
Hmm.
savory tomato jam. That we used to make a lot of in the summer in India because you
Oh,
get
okay.
so much fresh tomatoes and you don't know what to do with them,
Right.
and then you're bulk cooking something and it turns into
Hmm.
something amazing. So she had made that along with dosas, which are these lentil and rice crepes basically.
Hmm.
um, and it was just such a wonderful reminder of how mom food is always, it's just a class apart, it's something special.
That sounds delicious. No doses from my mom, but we won't we won't get it. We'll leave her cooking out of this conversation for now. Um, we will. I'll just say, it's interesting. I think, it depends on your roots. I mean, a little bit. My family, kind of has a little bit that sort of American food culture before, Julia Childs kind of got us back into some real cooking. So I guess I'll leave it at that and say but it's been interesting how like now in my generation, when we get together, there's a kind of like that bigger interest in cooking actually. So my parents are happy to reap the benefits of it. So it's a little bit of the converse of maybe the traditional paradigm that you suggested. But anyway, speaking on the cooking topic, I need some help. It's getting toward the end of our CSA farm share, all kinds of great veggies rolling. And actually, the first one, before I forget my question, so one of the things I got was the Brussels sprout with the big, you've probably seen it as it grows. They don't break it off for you like they do like with just the little actual sprouts like would buy at the store. You get the whole stalk. So I don't know if you've ever gotten it that way. My first thing is I got home late from something last night and I was just like, what do I need to take? Do I just stick the whole it's like a little tree in the fridge? Do I need to take the stuff off before I prep it? I don't know if you even know the answer to it. I was going to Google it. Then I said, maybe Shruti will know.
Yeah, so I think you can, I mean, some people sometimes eat it. Like I actually grew Brussels sprouts in my backyard last year.
Really?
Yep.
Oh,
So the leaves are not edible, but the stalk is somewhat similar to a broccoli stalk, but it is a
mm-hmm.
very acquired taste. I think.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so if you
Interesting.
really want to be zero waste, you could probably
Mm-hmm.
chop it up and saute it and kind of
Wow.
serve it alongside. But it is, you want to be looking for the softer portions of the stem, because if it's got
Okay.
really woody, then it's very tough and chewy even after cooking
Okay.
it down.
Yeah.
But if you get some of the like softer stalks, which means it's been harvested while it's still very tender and wonderful, uh,
Yeah.
you can treat it like broccoli stalks and just
Oh,
kind of
that's interesting.
chop it up and saute it with your favorite seasoning, and it's quite delicious.
Well, that sounds good. Now, how about any ideas for the actual sprout, the actual part that is typically acquired if you're buying it at a store or a market?
Yeah, I feel like Brussels sprouts get such a bad rep
Mm-hmm.
because, I feel like when I remember the first time I ever had Brussels sprouts was in the US. We don't really get sprouts in India.
Yep.
And I remember my college roommate telling me that her mom used to just boil or steam the sprouts and then add salt on top of it.
Hmm.
And I was like, surely there has to be a better way
Yeah.
to eat
That doesn't sound so great. No.
Exactly. So what I usually do, depending on how much time I have, I would usually wash up the sprouts, dry them pretty well, chop them up, just into, take off the edges, chop them up into halves, drizzle with some olive oil, salt, pepper, and just throw them in the air fryer. Because
Yeah.
now they get super crispy, and then the nuttiness comes out, and especially the loose leaves become really
Mm-hmm.
like chips.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after they come out, you can add other seasoning on top if you want, like lemon juice or cheese or garlic powder or whatever. Um,
Hmm.
but that's probably one of the easiest ways to eat Brussels sprouts. But if you're looking for something a bit different or a little bit more adventurous, I have used Brussels sprouts to make salads. So you just shred the Brussels sprouts in like a food processor,
Hmm.
and it's really good. You can make a pretty terrific Caesar salad with it
Hmm.
because I find that the nuttiness actually goes really well with the creamy Caesar dressing.
Oh, that sounds really good. I think I've had that kind of thing out at some at some kind of restaurant or something. It's very good. I've never tried it at home, but you
Yeah,
just got to
no,
chop it thin enough, probably. Yeah.
exactly. Or if you have a food processor, you can just
Oh, yeah,
put
sure.
them in there and kind of have it shred.
Yep.
Um, the other two things that I love making with Brussels sprouts that are a little bit more adventurous are latkes. So
Oh,
instead
okay.
of using just all potatoes, I usually
Hmm.
throw a little bit of sprouts in there, and
Oh,
it
okay.
actually gives a really nice kind of crunchy texture,
Hmm.
in combination with the soft kind of potato texture. Um, or I like making shakshuka with it. So I
Oh,
will
okay.
add it sometimes to the base of my shakshuka, like, nicely chop it down or shred it, and then just add it in along with some spinach and tomatillos and tomatoes, and makes a really terrific green shakshuka.
Oh, that sounds good. Yeah, I think I haven't seen it with so many veggies, but that would be healthier, definitely. Definitely great. And I think I told you I also have butternut squash, popular this time of year. And do you have a favorite way to prepare that, or ways, or tips?
Probably the good old, roasted butternut squash
Hmm.
is really hard to beat that. It's
Yeah.
so creamy, and you can kind of take it in so many different directions. So once you roast the butternut squash, you can add a little bit of Thai curry paste and make it really, Asian inspired, or you can
Hmm.
keep it super simple and add a dash of cream and some, red pepper flakes or something, and make it much more easier and accessible. um, I have also tried to make a vegan version of it, and the best part is like the leftover soup. You can actually toss some pasta in it, and it makes a great kind of vegan alternative for mac and cheese.
Oh,
It's
nice.
not quite the same. I know that
Sure.
folks are going to be like, "Well, it's not really cheese, Shruthi." Uh,
Yeah.
but I think if you are practicing a vegan diet, then I think along with some nutritional yeast or vegan cheese, it gives that rich color and the creaminess to your mac and cheese. So it's a great way to use up leftovers too. But I'll
Oh,
probably
okay.
say boring on that and say like I just love a good bowl of butternut squash soup with some crusty bread.
Oh, yeah. Hey, that sounds good. Yeah, the idea of the with a mac and cheese type style without the cheese. I've done like orzo cooked up, so like almost like cooked orzo like risotto with some cube butternut squash, and that came out pretty well. That combo, but that I could see that consistency if you actually have it pureed or something. That would be good.
Yeah.
Yum,
Or
yum.
actually, I think one of the things that folks would always ask is, while I make soup, I actually just chop it in half, scoop out the seeds, and I throw the whole butternut, squash kind of half down into the
Hmm.
oven to roast it because you're going to
Yeah.
scale up and blend it anyway.
Right.
You are cubing, then you'll have to peel the skin.
Yeah.
Super easy trick to do that is to poke some holes in the skin with your like a fork,
Oh,
put it in
okay.
the microwave for a couple minutes, and then the skin just slides right off. It becomes so
You
much
know,
easier, and you don't have to like.
I I feel like I've heard that a while ago. So that's the way to get the skin off. Is it? Did I also now? Do you have it first? Okay.
You don't have to, but I have usually found that it's a little
Hmm.
bit easier to like get a hold.
Yeah.
It depends on how big your microwave is too.
Yeah. Because I feel like I heard someone and maybe even giving the tip as far as because it can get pretty tough to get that. I've had my knife, feel like it's Excalibur, with the knife stuck in the squash, and you're like, and
Exactly.
I actually I think it was a squash that had an issue about a couple of years ago where the knife slipped out and I got a pretty good cut. So I'm a little cautious now around my squash and knife situation.
Yeah, and
So
microwaving it makes it a little bit easier to chop it
yeah,
down in half too. So if
nice,
you have a big enough microwave, you can just poke some holes and throw the whole thing in there.
cool. That's a good tip. Now, when we were emailing back and forth, we also talked about hot peppers, and I thought that might be a transition to also talk about. I like the sound. It sounds like a tasty I don't know, a tasty combination of both Indian food and Nigerian food that is under your roof. So, and hot peppers play a role in both of those. So, um, yeah, tell us more about that because I think, I think some. If you're grown up, I have my heritage is Irish, and there's not a lot of jalapeno peppers coming out of Ireland. So, for folks that aren't as familiar with how to really lean into peppers, yeah, let's share a little bit, and maybe we can learn more about those cuisines as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think as I said, I grew up in India, and Indian food can be spicy. I don't think it always is spicy, but I think the one thing that we do use is like a wide range of different types of peppers. There's dried peppers, there's dried and powdered peppers, there's fresh peppers, and so I grew up eating a lot of that even as a child. And I thought my spice tolerance was pretty high until I met my husband.
Okay.
My husband comes from the southern part of Nigeria, so it's from Lagos, which is kind of the big cosmopolitan, the New York equivalent
Yeah.
of Nigeria. um, and their culture, or like the tribe that he's descended from, are really known for makes your mouth explode spicy food,
Oh, okay.
because like they basically grind Scotch bonnet or habanero peppers into everything.
Wow.
The
Okay.
point where if he's not sweating as he's eating it, he thinks it's not spicy enough.
Oh my.
I would joke that I don't understand if he has any taste buds left, but he insists that he does. And I think over the course of time, after we met each other, started dating, and got married, now we've kind of come to a happy medium where I think my spice tolerance has increased a little bit, and his
Yep.
spice requirements have decreased a little bit, so we can meet at a somewhere in the middle and actually enjoy the dishes.
That
Um,
sounds like a good thing. Good thing, definitely.
but to your question about integrating peppers in your diet, like I think people generally have a good sense of spice tolerance, right? And there's such a wide range of peppers that you can get in the US. And so my suggestion would be to take it slow and not go
Hmm.
from not eating peppers at all to eating Scotch bonnet peppers, right?
Right. Right.
You don't want to go all the way there, but you can probably slowly, add a jalapeno in there. Maybe next you can add Anaheim or Serrano peppers. And it might be helpful to look up the Scoville heat scale that tells you, how hot different peppers are. And I think the other way to do it is also to look at either dried peppers or dried and ground up peppers, because then you feel like you get a little bit more control. It's not all or nothing. So you can kind
Oh,
of
okay.
sprinkle a little bit and, into a
Hmm.
soup or something like that and see how it tastes and get a little bit more used to integrating spices. But I think well seasoned doesn't always mean spicy. And so
Right.
I think a lot of the times you can use these peppers to season your food pretty well
Hmm.
without having to take it all the way, spicy, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in some cases, especially if it's a more mild, like a jalapeno, it brings like a freshness almost to the dish as much as anything, as
Yeah,
opposed
totally.
to the
Like in a
the.
guac or something, right? Like you can
Hmm.
chop up half a jalapeno and add it to your
Yeah.
guac and see how you like it. And then, there are some folks, like even in my family, that just can't handle any spices. And so
Right.
in that case, we just take it down quite a bit, and instead use more flavored seasoning instead of spicy seasoning. But I found that like most people will kind of eventually figure out what their spice tolerance is and be able to integrate spices in a way that is still within that tolerance, but like maybe trying something new.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know, in addition to you mentioning Indian and Nigerian food, I know you're a big world traveler. I think I saw 60 countries or something. I'm curious the extent to which, does your cooking, does it wind up being more like fusion, or is it like tonight I'm making Nigerian food and the next night it's Indian, the next night it's maybe some other cool place you've been? What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because it was actually the genesis of my food blog. Was because I traveled to all of these places, a lot of which was because of my work. I used to work for the United Nations, for the World Food Program, and
Hmm.
as I said, I've been to all seven continents. I've been to 60 plus countries. I think now I'm at 64. Uh,
Wow.
and a lot of it was because of work. It wasn't necessarily just leisure travel. But
Hmm.
over the course of those journeys as a vegetarian, I'm a lifelong vegetarian. I've never had meat
Yep.
in my life.
Wow.
And
Okay.
in stark contrast, my husband is a carnivore. Like he's not even an omnivore. He needs meat in every meal.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Okay.
we'll talk about that over over a
Yeah.
drink.
Yeah. Definitely. Let's touch on that one.
But I think over the course of so many journeys, I was always on the lookout for vegetarian food in all of these countries. And
Hmm.
what I realized is that there are some cuisines where vegetarianism is naturally a big part of the culture, right? Like, for
Yeah.
instance, Indian food comes to mind, obviously. Ethiopian cuisine is like super vegetarian friendly because they have a
Hmm.
fasting culture for
Oh,
like
yeah.
some days of the year where they just don't eat meat, for
Right.
religious reasons. And so when I was there, I didn't really struggle with finding vegetarian food. And likewise, the Middle East has a lot of like dips and spreads and things like that, which would make it much easier to find veggie food. But then there were other places, like when I went to China or when I went to Nigeria, where I really struggled because even though there were a lot of vegetable forward dishes, a lot of them would be cooked in pork lard or
Ah, sure. Right.
beef stock or something like that,
Hmm.
and it did make it quite difficult to figure stuff out. And so I think the genesis of the blog was actually to find authentic recipes,
Hmm.
but meat-free recipes. So for
Okay.
instance, there's a Nigerian spinach stew, which like the entire country loves.
Hmm.
It's called efo riro, and it's made with an African spinach, and it's usually made with
Hmm.
stockfish and beef stock and a bunch of things.
Oh, yeah.
I experimented over, I don't even know, a year and a half, and like figured out a way to veganize it. And
Hmm.
now, folks routinely email me and they say, hey, like I'm Nigerian and I grew up eating this, and I was looking for a vegan version, and I'm so glad I found your recipe because it helps me, it takes me back to my cultural roots, but in a vegan way.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that was kind of the genesis of the blog to begin with, is just experimenting with a lot of these cuisines and trying to get to authentic recipes. But when it comes to just cooking food for myself at home, I think it's definitely a mixture of things. Like I would make a Nigerian rice dish and something
Yeah.
Indian. Then we would serve it with air fried Brussels sprouts
Okay.
as, as a veggie side,
Nice.
And so
Yeah.
it's definitely more of a mixture for day-to-day meals. But
Yeah.
my blog is usually structured around different cuisines.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I know. I know. Tends to be a little differentiation between what we bloggers put on our sites and what we eat day to day, for sure.
Especially on
Um,
food day, right? Because then you're eating
yeah.
butter jelly sandwiches.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, picking up on something you touched upon, I'm curious. You mentioned your husband being a carnivore, and I'm thinking I have a 17-year-old one under our roof that definitely where that term applies. And my wife and my wife, when we met, was vegetarian. We had the same issue in Kentucky as where we met, and similarly, somebody would say, "Oh, well, here are some beans," and sure enough, it was clearly cooked with the ham hock or something like that, which clearly
Mhm.
doesn't work. So, but she and I kind of evolved to probably plant forward dishes, but sometimes some meat or fish or chicken in there. But for your people like your husband who looking for something that feels hearty and substantial, some tips you would share with your audience for how to prepare in general, things that might apply across different dishes for making a meat lover feel satisfied eating a vegetarian or vegan meal.
Yeah, I think it can go kind of one of two ways, right? I personally, for my husband and myself in my house, the way we tend to do meals is that I don't care that he cooks meat or eats meat, right? Like sometimes I will even grill meat for him or make something,
Mm-hmm.
but I just don't eat it. And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes he would just kind of, make a pork chop on the side, and then I would have a full meal, and he would just add the meat portion to his pasta dish or just eat it
Yeah.
on the side or something like that. And that's kind of
Yep.
the easier way to do it, right?
Right. Right.
But I think if you're trying to actually make vegetarian or meat-free dishes much more substantive, I have found that there's plenty of ways in which you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Mushrooms are a great example, right?
Oh
Because they
yeah.
really add that umami flavor, and
Mm-hmm.
you can cook them in so many different ways. Like in fact, I use mushroom in the stew that I was just mentioning, where
Oh yeah.
a lot more mushrooms, but I think it gives you the same kind of heartiness in a dish as you might get from meat chunks or something like that.
Hmm.
Of course, like, you can always go down the path of, farm meat products. So, for instance, if it's a Impossible or a Beyond Burger or, taco crumbles or something like that,
Yep.
which I think, or you can make meat crumbles at home, usually with a mixture of mushrooms, walnuts, etc., and it actually
Hmm.
does mimic the texture, and you can season it in a way that it mimics the taste of what you would traditionally associate with, like, a regular burger or something like that,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
much easier to do on dishes where it's not a slab of meat, right? Like, it's going to be
Hmm.
very difficult to make anything that is not steak actually taste and feel like steak.
Right.
But if you're just making a beef stew, it becomes a little bit easier because there's already so much other stuff going on that you can get relatively close to approximating kind of the taste and texture of some of the meat products.
Yeah.
And so we kind of go both ways in our
Hmm.
house. Like, it's always funny because I would often taste the fake meat products and I would ask my husband, like, "Oh, is this what meat actually tastes like? I've never had meat in my life." And he's like,
Yeah.
"No, not quite. But if I put all these other things on top and I'm having it as a burger, you could
Hmm.
convince me that, I was actually eating a beef patty."
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah.
I can see that. Nice. And is there a favorite? Is there a win, like a one example of a dish that really, like your husband really loves, that's, craves that carnivore in him, but is not, doesn't have any meat involved?
Yeah, I make a pretty mean vegetarian shepherd's pie. Well,
Oh, okay. That sounds good. So what's in that?
so usually I use I mean, you kind of start out the same way, but then instead of using lamb or beef, I usually use a mixture of mushrooms and walnuts.
Oh, okay.
You kind
Yeah.
of rough chop it together so that it
Hmm.
gets more of that, like, chunky texture. I cook it with, vegan Worcestershire sauce and a little bit of, like, actually you can add a tinge of soy sauce in there too to bring out more of the umami flavors.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it works out really well. I will note that I don't usually cook that vegan. Like, I do add, it's a cheesy mashed potato layer on top,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and so it, like, actually helps bring it a little bit closer because you get, like, that really nice brown cheese, golden brown on top, and you get
Yum. Yeah. Getting hungry.
super hearty.
Yeah, I love it. I love shepherd's pie. I think I have had a vegan version before, or at least vegetarian. Yeah, that sounds really good.
Yeah, so I think I mean, he really loves that, and he
Yeah.
actually prefers it to the original meaty version because I think it's a way to, like, make it a little bit healthier and not as calorie heavy, if you're using more veggies and, mushrooms and stuff versus just chunks of meat. But
Yeah. Great. Great. Now, before we close, I'd love to hear. I don't. We've talked about, you started earlier on talking about food waste, something a concern of yours. Do you have any other kind of tips that we haven't covered, whether it be, how to make the most of the food, that the produce that you've picked up, if you have a CSA like I do, or a farmer's market, or other tips that you use in your kitchen to make the most of it as much as possible?
yeah. I mean, first of all, I would probably say that there's the thing. I feel so grateful to live in the US, because there's just so many things that are available year round that all make really hearty, delicious kind of dishes, right? So there's, like,
Hmm.
good mix of things that no matter where you are in the US, like, I think you can get access to.
Hmm.
And so that I'm very grateful for that. So I often remind myself about that when I think,
Right. That's a good
and I
point.
try to, like, just make sure that we're not wasting, we're using leftovers. And so, to the degree that, you can avoid some of those things, I think that's already a step in the right direction. Um, I'm also really grateful that I live on the West Coast, right? Because I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I mean, the abundance of vegetables and fruits and berries and things that you get over here is just, it's astounding. Um,
Hmm.
but I think one of the biggest tips that I give to my readers and my friends is to really get a sense of what seasonal, like, food actually looks like. Because I
Yeah.
think the flip side of always having access to all the things in the US is that sometimes you don't recognize just how much more, whether you care about the environment or whether you just care about the freshness and the taste or anything, like,
Hmm.
or the health benefits, just
Right.
how much goes into the system to make sure that all of these foods are available year round, right? I'm not talking
Yeah.
about potatoes. Those are actually fine because you can You can't actually get
Hmm.
them around, but
Right.
you get asparagus out of season, it's being air freighted from Latin America, right?
Sure.
Which is why out of season, it's like $10 at the grocery store.
Yeah.
But then when you get it in season, in sometime between March and May, you're paying maybe $5 at the grocery store. And so
Hmm.
I think and you don't have to do it all at once, but I think as you're, picking up things or, produce especially that are not part of your like kind of weekly routine. So I'm not talking about bananas and potatoes and onions, but, if you're picking up asparagus or if you're picking up, kohlrabi or butternut squash or whatever it is, just
Hmm.
keeping an eye or even Googling quickly, like when this is in season. There
Yeah.
are plenty of resources, like even from the government, that talk about when things are in season, or the sniff test, right? Like you go to the store and you see that squash is suddenly selling for $12. Like you probably know it's not in season.
Right.
And trying to buy things that are more in season can actually help with um, kind of getting the freshest produce the right time. It saves you money, it tastes better. And when in doubt, like if you want, like you can always get frozen vegetables.
Right.
I don't believe in, I think sometimes we can get really like hung up on, oh my God, we have to go to a farmer's market or we have to go to a CSA. But I think even
Mhm.
acknowledging, especially with the current kind of economic environment, right? Like foods that are frozen are usually frozen at their peak, which
That's
means
true. Yep.
you're actually getting the right nutritional value
Hmm.
and like, the freshness because it was frozen when it was the freshest. And so if all else fails, like, if you're looking at something, if you're looking at green beans in November and you're like, this is not really looking good, they look kind of sad,
Hmm.
don't hesitate to actually go and pick up frozen vegetables because I think it can also be a great way to support local communities, make sure you're still eating seasonal, and while still keeping it more affordable for what you want to put out on the dinner table for your family.
Yeah, nice. I think you hit upon nicely. There are a lot of values and goals we have when we're thinking about putting our family's meals together. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a balancing, and I do think, yeah, sometimes it's easy and a topic that we get passionate about, like food, to get like, it's only got to be something within 100 miles. And sure, the more of that you do, the great. But like to think, to exclude from your diet frozen vegetables, for instance, it's you know problematic and probably not a suboptimal approach, but something that's a little more balanced. I like that.
Exactly.
Cool. So before we sign off, we've referenced this blog of yours that sounds like has all kinds of great tips and recipes. And I know I did check it out a bit before our interview. I'm gonna definitely bookmark it and follow you to get more good stuff. But tell our audience where we can find you on the web and social and that stuff.
Yeah, I am Urban Farmie on everything. So Farmie as in it's like foodie, but farmie because I actually grow my own vegetables and practice seasonal eating, which is why this podcast has been great. So that's Urban, Urban, Farmie, Farmie. You can find me on Instagram, that's urbanfarmie.com, Facebook, Pinterest, wherever you hang out socially, I am Urban Farmie there.
Excellent. Well, we will be sure to check that out and encourage our listeners to do so as well. It's been great chatting with you and learning more about all your tasty cooking and your background in food.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Cook Local, Eat Local. To get the show notes with links for recipes and resources we covered today, go to cooklocaleatlocal.com to get the podcast landing page. And please be sure to subscribe to Cook Local, Eat Local wherever you get your podcasts. Make it a great day with some tasty local food on your plate.